I'd like to go right to Dr. Daniel Davis, who is also on teleconference with us, and he'll be doing another presentation on COVID-19 update.
Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Davis.
Good. Well, thank you for having me back. Sorry for the audio difficulties, and I heard someone comment on the picture you see there, which was done by one of our young Avalon residents, Iris, back in July. But I like this picture, so I was looking for an opportunity to stick it into one of the presentations.
Good job.
So given that everyone is now an expert on everything coronavirus based on our previous presentations, I don't have to spend quite as much time explaining everything, but we will spend a bit of time talking about the vaccines, because I think that's going to be important going forward, and I want to try and address people's concerns and questions, and then take any additional questions. So we will go over our numbers, including our Catalina specific numbers, and then spend most of the time talking about the vaccine and speculating as to what the next month might look like. All right, so these are graphs that you're used to seeing. These are the California new cases on the top and the deaths on the bottom. And if we start labeling these as we go further and further into this pandemic, what you see on the screen here is the initial wave in the spring. What you see in the middle there is the kind of early to mid-summer wave. And then what you're seeing right now is the mid-fall wave. And if we play our numbers game, and the purists will react a little bit, because this isn't exactly how you calculate the death rate, but if you're doing quick and dirty calculations at home, you can see that at the beginning we had about a 5% death rate based on the number of cases versus the number of reported deaths. In the summer we saw about a 2%, and what we're currently seeing, based on between 15 and 20,000 new cases a day and about 100 new deaths a day, is less than 1%, 0.6%. And so it looks like we're doing a whole lot better with the virus, and I think we are doing better for sure. But we are clearly seeing a surge in new cases from people who have minimal symptoms, people who are generally healthier than what we saw back in the spring, and people who are asymptomatic as part of our contact tracing efforts. We'll go a little bit deeper in a second. This is the map of California with new cases, and you see that Los Angeles is clearly in the heart of things, as is Imperial County down by the border. And if we look at the United States, and if you talk to Dr. McGroarty, you will know that much of the United States is right in the thick of things, and hospitals are again becoming taxed with very high positive rates, particularly in the center of the country there. Whether our time is yet to come, and that we just haven't seen the cold weather that drives everyone indoors, or whether we're going to dodge at least the severe illness that they're seeing in the Midwest, remains to be seen. If you go back a couple of slides, it does have the look of a peak and then a subsequent drop. However, a lot of that may be driven by, and I'm going to move forward a little bit here, the amount of new tests. So what you see here is the rate of positive cases on the top, the same one I've been showing you, but on the bottom you see the number of tests being performed. And we saw going into the Thanksgiving holiday a huge wave in the number of tests, in part driven by people who are symptomatic, many of whom did not have COVID but had the seasonal upper respiratory infection, but also people who are being tested because they had travel plans, because they wanted to risk stratify in going home for the holidays or having people over, or because their works were asking them to be tested. And when you test twice as many people, you're going to see twice as many cases. But again, many of these new cases are less symptomatic than what we saw early in the pandemic, and that probably explains most of why the mortality rates are much lower now. I skipped over my favorite slide of all, and you should be used to seeing this one. This reflects my role as the medical director for Riverside County Fire Department. And this is to me, the most telling slide of all, because it tells us how many patients are either calling 911 or going to the emergency department with an influenza-like illness. And we use that term because, for the most part, up until this year, the main illness that taxed the medical system every winter was influenza. So we got used to using the term influenza-like illness. Now there's a new term floating around out there, which is PIC, that's pneumonia, influenza, and COVID, but it hasn't caught on, and we still use influenza-like illness. But what we're seeing here is a continuation of the same graph I've showed you each time I've spoke, and that is from about a year ago now, the initial wave of influenza-like illness due to influenza, where 10% of emergency department visits and 6% of EMS calls were due to a flu-like illness. That tapered off in February going into March of 2020, and then we saw the first spike in coronavirus in late March, early April, where the rates of ED visits were about 10% again, and the rates of EMS calls were 6 to 7%, very similar. Then in the summer, when we saw a huge number of cases, the rate of emergency department visits was only 3 to 4%, and EMS calls 2 to 3%. And now, where we see record numbers of cases, we haven't budged from 1% for the last 2 or 3 months. So there still remains, at least in Southern California, and that's being Riverside County, a disconnect between a sort of sensationalized reports from the news and what we see, at least in our area, clinically. Now, that being said, that graph of the United States tells you that not every part of the United States is experiencing this the same way, and I think we learned that from the beginning of the pandemic. But thus far, we have not been overwhelmed in our areas here, and so we have to decide, or we have to prepare for our wave, or hope that this one passes us by, and that will bring up the issue of the vaccine. And again, this was the graph I showed you before, where the number of new cases pretty much parallels the number of tests. And here's Catalina's data on the bottom. I tried to compile those tests that are positive here on the island, as well as people that we sent tests for over town, and then received the positive test. But it gets a little bit tricky because we don't necessarily have all of those cases compiled. But nevertheless, you see that Catalina tends to mirror what's happening in California overall. And we've even had a few additional cases since I made this graph 2 days ago, with a couple of positives in the last 24 to 36 hours. But again, we saw a spike in cases in July and August. It tapered off in September and October, and now we're seeing the number of cases go up again. And whether we'll see it come back down or not remains to be seen. Overall, one of the observations that we've made is that most of the cases have not been from the tourists coming in with the disease. Most have been people who live here in the island and went over town, either to the Los Angeles area or sometimes even down into Mexico, contracted it from people they knew, brought it back to the island. So I think our initial fear about the tourists being the main vector into Catalina perhaps is a bit unfounded. But thus far, even though the medical center is not a public health entity and we don't have the right to actually track people down and demand to know everyone with whom each positive case has come into contact, doing it on a volunteer basis has been largely successful in that we haven't seen sustained spread. In general, we'll hear of a positive case or identify a positive case, and then maybe 1 or 2 generations beyond that. But there has not been the sustained spread, despite the fact that Avalon itself has very high density compared to Los Angeles and to Long Beach, as I showed at one of the very first presentations. And that when we've identified cases, in general, we've been successful at doing what's now being called hospital at home, that is, keeping people in their house, quarantined, but being able to gauge their symptoms and even monitor their oxygen saturation values so that we've been able to make appropriate triaging. And that has really been a testament to the coordination between the community and the medical center. The folks that we've had to transfer over have generally done well. They've generally been admitted for monitoring and in some cases therapy, but knock on wood, we've had no deaths directly due to coronavirus. And one of our biggest priorities has been the long-term care facility, which shares walls with the hospital, so we've been particularly vigilant at trying to keep those residents safe. All right, so now let's jump into the vaccine. I made some graphics to try and explain how this all works. And so we're going to start with a traditional vaccine. Here you see my version of a virus. It kind of looks like a coronavirus with those little spike proteins, but I put some other proteins shaped like triangles out there as well. And the traditional way of making a vaccine was to do something to deactivate the virus, either kill it with heat or grind it up into little pieces, do something that then allows it to be safely injected into a person without causing disease, but then allowing the immune system to start to recognize those proteins. And here you see antibodies, my version of antibodies that recognize the triangles, and here's some that recognize the circles. Once these antibodies have been formed, they are retained in the body, at least in the memory of certain immune cells, so that when the virus reappears, immediately antibodies start to emerge and do two things. One, they prevent the virus from being able to attack healthy cells by glomming on to the outside where those proteins sit. And number two, they plant a flag in those viruses so the immune system knows to destroy those viral cells. And so antibodies become the main host defense against a reinfection. Now, what's different this time through? Why didn't we just do the same thing done? Well, it turns out that the coronavirus and other similar viruses are really hard to grow in culture, and so it's really hard to make enough of it to be able to create enough vaccines to keep everyone safe. There are countries that have tried that, and China is probably the most prominent, but the prediction is that they may have trouble vaccinating everyone, and their hope is that it disappears before they need to, because again, it's very hard to grow this particular virus in culture enough to be able to create enough vaccines. So what we're seeing is some different technologies that may ultimately be more effective and safer than the traditional approach. So here I have a regular human cell, and that green thing is the nucleus. And from that nucleus, little copies of messenger RNA are constantly being made. So here you see 4 different colors. And each of those encodes a certain protein that's necessary for all sorts of stuff. For growth, for the immune system, for digestion, for hormones. And so once these pieces of mRNA make it out of the nucleus, then part of the machinery of the cell takes over and starts building proteins, almost like a blueprint. So here you see the green moon, the red cross, the blue lightning bolt, the purple, whatever that thing is. This would be normal function of a cell. Now, somehow we need to get virus protein in there for the immune system to recognize. And these new technologies take a vaccine and introduce mRNA that represents the virus, the viral proteins, into the cell. One strategy is just to take mRNA, encapsulate it, surround it with a balloon that looks almost like a cell. And another strategy is to take a virus that isn't real harmful. And the one that's being used the most is the adenovirus that normally would infect a chimpanzee, but doesn't cause disease in humans. And put some of the coronavirus blueprint inside, and each of those has a way of getting it into a human cell, where then the mRNA sits there and gets made into proteins just like it was human mRNA, messenger RNA. So the blueprint from the virus is used just as easily as the blueprint from a human cell to make proteins, in this case, the spike protein. That's the one that gives the coronavirus its name. It's the thing that kind of characterizes the coronavirus, and everyone has targeted. And now just antibodies against that spike protein form and ultimately confer the same sort of immunity. Now, there were some questions. We didn't know if that would work. It wasn't ever demonstrated that you could get mRNA from coronavirus, or any virus for that matter, into human cells, or that the human cells would make enough protein to stimulate antibody production, or that the virus wouldn't mutate so fast that by the time the vaccine was delivered, that spike protein was different, and that no longer did the original antibodies recognize that spike protein. So the biggest question in everyone's mind was, would it work? And this technology was unproven. Now, the first two vaccines that you've heard about on the news, the one from Pfizer and the one from Moderna, use those little balloons. And the big question there was whether the mRNA, which is kind of unstable, could make it all the way into a human cell. Several of the other vaccines being tested use one of those adenoviruses, a non-harmful virus. And the question there was whether our immune systems, especially those of us who are over the age of 50, would have seen enough adenoviruses in our life, even if we never saw that one that's meant for chimpanzees, that we've seen enough of them that we would destroy that virus before it could transfer its mRNA to the human cell. So there are some questions about that technology. Now, there are some questions about vaccines in general that apply probably more to a traditional vaccine. When you mush up a virus and inject it in there, does it maybe work too well? Does the immune system form too many antibodies that either overreact if you ultimately see then a COVID again, or those antibodies that start to react with normal human protein? Because some of them look kind of similar, and we think that a lot of diseases that we didn't realize were autoimmune might actually be related to the formation of antibodies that cross-react between virus proteins and human proteins and actually start attacking that person. In theory, that would be less of an issue with these mRNA or these adenoviral strategies, because they're targeting one specific protein as opposed to just putting the whole virus in there and letting whatever happens happen. But that was still a question. And then the question, I think, still lingers, how long is this going to last? We've heard news reports that antibody levels drop pretty quickly in some patients, and even maybe people who get coronavirus more than once. So do we have any answers? Well, if you've listened to the news in the last couple of weeks, you've heard that those first two mRNA-based vaccines have had incredible effectiveness, incredible efficacy. I mean, this is beyond anything anybody could have even hoped for. We were talking about maybe 50% being successful. That's kind of what the influenza vaccine is like every year. And both of them came in with almost identical numbers of 95%. And if really all you care about is people who get really sick, that getting a little bit of a cold doesn't really bother you too much, the Moderna vaccine had 0 cases of severe illness. So that would make it 100% successful in preventing severe COVID disease. Now, granted, they haven't had a huge number of patients yet, but again, the numbers have been so incredibly good that they will probably both get approved and be available for dosing before the end of this month. It's now December. Now, there were some questions about that adenovirus. Like I said, we were kind of worried that it wasn't going to work as well in people over the age of 50 because we might attack the friendly virus that was going to deliver the mRNA and destroy it before it could do its job. But it turned out that there was a human error that has made this really hard to interpret. The first 3,000 patients in their study got the wrong dose. They realized it after those first 3,000 and corrected it, so they have more than 10,000, close to 20,000 with the correct dose. But then it turned out that the half dose did better than the correct dose. And so now they're trying to get it approved at the lower dose, which was a mistake to begin with. And most scientists are saying, hey, wait a sec, you can't do it that way. That wasn't your intent. And in fact, if you look at the two groups, the first 3,000 were younger people, and this is our big concern about this adenovirus, that maybe it doesn't work as well in older people, so maybe these effectiveness numbers are not as good. They tried to say that the wrong dose was about 90% effective. What they thought was going to be the right dose was only about 50 or 60% effective. Let's split the difference and call it 70%. What do you guys think? And most people are saying, I don't think so. So we're waiting to see if anybody will even approve this one, especially if the first two are as effective as they appear to be. Now, there are some advantages in the more traditional vaccines, especially the first one I showed you, where all you do is try and kill it and put it in a syringe and inject it into your arm. Again, it's going to be hard to produce enough, but the nice thing is that you can keep that in a refrigerator. The problem with at least one of the mRNA vaccines is it has to be kept not just in a freezer, but a super cooled freezer. They apparently have created something they call the pizza box that allows it to stay cold with some sort of cardboard container packed in dry ice, and that it can be delivered to a regular refrigerator freezer and kept there for about a week. And so in our preparations, we are anticipating that we may end up getting that virus first, where we have to use the pizza box to keep it cool for a week and deliver all the vaccines very quickly, as opposed to the other one, which you appear to be able to just keep it in a regular freezer. But some of these other vaccines, you might just say, well, why don't they just pack it up and say, you know, they're not even close to the effectiveness of the first two, and they screwed up their study. Why not just call it a day? But again, it may be that they use some of these other vaccines in places that don't have the storage capabilities, because they can be kept in things like just regular refrigerators. We haven't seen any issues about the vaccines working too well, safety issues, etc. There have been lots of rumors going around, maybe that the Russian vaccine, maybe the Chinese vaccine, but we haven't seen any data yet, so we don't know if there have been any cases where either an overreaction or an autoimmune reaction have occurred. But in those first two, where theoretically that's less of a risk, their data has now been submitted, and they did not see any increase in either of those events. So it appears to be as safe as we hoped it would be with such a targeted therapy or a targeted way to create the antibodies. And then the last question, is it going to last? Well, this is where you'll hear a lot about antibodies disappearing after 3 or 4 or 6 months. That's really not the thing that we should be measuring. The most important thing are the T cells. You'll hear about T cells. The T cells are the ones that kind of keep the blueprints for the antibodies, and that they can ramp up production in a matter of hours once there's re-exposure to the virus. And that's a little harder to measure. It's not something where you just draw blood and measure it. So that's why most of the studies are focused on antibodies rather than T-cell reaction. But it wouldn't surprise me if the fact that antibodies fade over time is used to tell us that we probably ought to get a redosing at some interval, maybe on an annual basis, similar to the flu. The last question, which I didn't put on here, but I think fortunately doesn't seem to be as big of an issue as we feared, is whether the virus would mutate quickly enough to where the initial antibodies were no longer recognizing that spike protein, that the spike protein had changed enough to make it look like a new virus. That's essentially what happens to influenza every year. It's part of why influenza is a pain. But we're able to create a vaccine quickly every year, not as effective as we'd like, but still works okay, and that's based on the idea that it's always mutating and the proteins are always changing. So last year's vaccine doesn't necessarily work very well this year. We haven't seen that kind of behavior with coronavirus. For the most part, that spike protein has been unchanged since the beginning. And how are we going to dose this? Well, we just got word about 2 hours ago from the national committee that's looking at this, and their recommendations were fairly similar to what we're seeing from California and from Los Angeles. The first folks out of the tube will be the healthcare workers. Somewhere in there will be first responders who aren't healthcare workers, so that would be like policemen and firemen who aren't part of the EMS system. And they decided to put nursing home patients in that first tier as well. Then the second tier will be some blend of folks who have high-risk conditions, so heart disease, some sort of immunologic problems, so patients who perhaps are in chemotherapy or have other forms of immunocompromise. And then there's a lot of discussion about what to do with folks like prisoners who are packed into relatively small areas and have had high rates, or people who live in areas that have had higher rates than other areas. So they decided not to try to take that on yet because we don't have enough vaccine to get all the way down that line. And you can see from this graph, once you start getting to those populations, you need a whole lot of vaccine. The best guess is that it will be available to everyone probably by the spring, but it will come out in little waves, and that at each step they'll vaccinate an increasing population based on vulnerability. Other stuff really hasn't panned out too well. One thing you will see in the next week or so is a new guideline for quarantining. Probably that if you're exposed but you don't have any symptoms, that rather than getting tested right away, you'll wait for a week or at the most 10 days and then get tested. And at that point, if the test is negative, then you can be out of quarantine. That's still being debated, but it appears that everyone kind of goes along with that. And then, again, that's for asymptomatic people. That could potentially have impact on Catalina and Avalon, given that a lot of the testing that we do is based on someone at work or someone in the household identified as positive. And so rather than rushing to get tested then, especially within the first week where it's likely to be negative, even if it was passed on, the guideline will be to get tested at that 7 to 10 day mark. But at that point, if the test is negative, then the quarantining is no longer necessary. So we will definitely let you know about that. As far as treatment goes, although we'd like to think that that's partly responsible for the decrease in mortality, it's probably not the main reason. Probably mostly that the people testing positive have lesser symptoms and are generally healthier. But we are now routinely using steroids. The antiviral medication still requires IV administration, so it's mostly reserved for hospitalized patients. We haven't really seen emergency departments administering the antivirals because they have to be given for a period of time over multiple days. The oral medications that I've been excited about are still under investigation, so we haven't seen any results yet. We heard a little bit about monoclonal antibodies, so instead of giving someone a vaccine, you're sort of using antibodies, either somebody who recovered from COVID and using whatever antibodies are in their bloodstream and just taking the good with the bad, or very specific antibodies that are able to be produced that work against coronavirus. But they haven't been as effective as we hoped. They really haven't been a game changer, although they are FDA approved. Not all centers are even using them, and there isn't that much available. One interesting thing is that many of the newer antidepressants also have some activity against one of the immune receptors that seems to be involved in the switch from just coronavirus as a cold and maybe a little bit of a cough to this major immune system overreaction that lands people in the ICU on a ventilator and ultimately leads to their death. And so there may be recommendations over the next couple of weeks to use antidepressants for the critical period of time between diagnosis and the first, say, week and a half to try and prevent that transition from just an upper respiratory infection to a life-threatening disease that has you in the ICU. So don't be surprised if you hear that between now and the end of the year that one of the therapies we have available is an antidepressant, not because any people are necessarily depressed, but because they seem to prevent that transition. So what can all of you and all of we do? This is a critical point. This probably is the most important part of tonight's talk, that if you can hang in there just a little bit longer, we're racing the clock right now. That thing is on the right, in case you didn't pick that up. Because the vaccine will be available. It will be available before the end of the year, but not everyone is going to get it. Hopefully the most vulnerable get it sooner. But we're also entering traditionally the worst time of the year for flu-like illnesses. And so this is the critical time to kind of bunker down and do what you're supposed to do. The reason that I included the data that most of our cases have been folks who live on the island, who go off the island and then come back with the disease, is to underscore the importance that we really have control over whether this becomes a raging inferno on the island or not. And that has little to do with us allowing tourists in or not. This is the actions that we take on a daily basis. Whether we're wearing the mask, whether we're mingling with family and extended family to where we potentially are exposing some of the folks who have chronic illness to this. This is the time. And unfortunately for us, Thanksgiving and Christmas happen to fall right smack in the middle of our flu season. If we'd all live in Australia, it would be the opposite, where the flu season would be July and August, and we could pretty much expect nice, sunny, warm weather around Christmas time, but that's not the case here. And so we are entering the peak, and traditionally the peak of our flu season, influenza. We're entering in the time where we tend to spend more time with each other and with our family, and this is when we're seeing coronavirus spike, not surprisingly. So do what you need to do. I am not one who believes that we need to regulate everyone, but I believe that if we give them the information, they'll make the right choices. Keep working with the hospital. We're doing the best we can, and so far, knock on wood, it's been effective in preventing unchecked spread. So whenever you get symptoms, if you can call first, set up an appointment. We just added in a bunch of extra shifts for the telemedicine stuff. So you should be able to get one of the 4 main providers at any moment, any weekday anyways. And so call and try and set something up so we can talk it through. Check the website. We'll put the regulations on there because, again, we're expecting there to be a change in the way that we quarantine over the next week or two. And so that may affect when you're being sent in by your work or when you've had an exposure in your personal life. It may affect the way that we treat that, and that's partly why we have you talk to one of us so that we can figure out what the best strategy is going to be. And I like the term be a patient-patient and supporting each other. As much as we feel like this is a small town where everyone knows everybody else's business and has been at times perhaps not as understanding, I can tell you from living over town, it's been much better than it's been over there. Catalina is like a dream come true for epidemiologists and public health folks, because as scary as this has been, as frustrating as this has been, as devastating as it has been for folks who have businesses here and depend on tourism, this has been an amazingly successful effort by everyone. And if we can hang in there a little bit longer, I think we'll see this through to the end. without seeing any major catastrophes. With that, I will take whatever questions anybody has.
Are there questions from the, coming in on you, for you, Michael?
I have one question that came in. The comment is submitted by Jim Lute-Johan. He writes, Dr. Davis, given the reporting that many people in the U.S. state they are unlikely to take the vaccine for COVID-19, how would you endeavor to convince a doubter to take it?
Well, I'm hoping that trying to explain it, that's my version of probably 2 weeks worth of medical school in 5 minutes. But I think I presented it much better than any of my professors, not to toot my own horn. But I can assure you that getting coronavirus is much more dangerous as far as the long-term effects than getting one of these initial mRNA viruses. I think people have a little bit of fear of the mRNA viruses because they're new technology, but really the concern was not that they were going to do something harmful, it's that they just wouldn't work. I'm astounded that they've worked as well as they have, because putting a little squirt of mRNA into a little balloon that's basically like a bubble of soap, putting that in there and expecting it to get into human cells enough to where we start making the proteins that normally we would have had to smush up a virus to make. I didn't think it would work, and it didn't work in the initial trials. So the fact that both of them have come up with the same numbers is amazing to me. But the concern that it's somehow dangerous because mRNA is unstable, well, that's just not how the biology works. This is very targeted, and for me it feels very similar to what's happened in cancer therapy, where now if you have a cancer therapy where we have a specific molecular target, you can get chemotherapy that is basically a pill that doesn't cause a lot of side effects and is much more effective than 20, 30 years ago when you would have gotten blasted with chemo that just took your entire immune system with it, and your hair and your gut, everything else in your body. This is very similar to the way these vaccines work. So this is like targeted therapy, and everything has come up in our favor. So if people are worried, I encourage them to ask questions. You can access us via email or through the server, or Tina Min, who's our communications director, she sends a lot of the emails to us when it becomes a very technical question. But the biggest concerns about vaccines are that they're so messy that you're throwing a bunch of proteins from the virus into somebody's body, and it's causing either an overreaction or a reaction to something that's going to attack yourself. And that just isn't as much of a concern with these. And given what we're seeing, and I think I've mentioned before that I'm responsible for one of the curricula that trains healthcare providers around the country on COVID, so I get to see a lot of the data early on. Catching coronavirus leaves you with a lot of long-term effects. And the post-COVID syndrome is something very real that probably has to do with that overactivation of the immune system. So I would much rather take my chances with any vaccine other than getting coronavirus, and I would much rather take my chances with an mRNA, which is very targeted and very specific to one protein, and just thank our lucky stars that it has worked as well as it has. But that's the best I can do to try to convince someone. I don't know if people want pictures of me getting mine, but I'll take it as soon as somebody's willing to give it to me. I tried to enter a trial, and they didn't need middle-aged white guys in the trial, unfortunately for me. But I wanted to be front and center, so early on I was trying to be part of the Moderna trial. They just never called me back because I didn't fit the demographic that they needed for the study. But yeah, I have less fear about this technology than any vaccine that's come before. And that, again, I'm just amazed at how well it's worked.
Can you?
I don't own any stock in the vaccine companies, unfortunately. If I was smart about it, I would have invested about 9 months ago, but I didn't, and I'm kicking myself, but at least I can promote them without feeling like I have a conflict of interest.
Could you just please repeat the information or answer the question? Has there been any data that shows you can contract the virus multiple times?
There are data. So let's see. I have to figure out how to answer that. So part of the problem with that is that there's a subset of people who get COVID, maybe 5%, 10%, somewhere in that range, who keep shedding virus from their nose for months and months and months. For a while, we thought that was just a long infection. And finally, and since South Korea was one of the early countries affected, they decided to actually try and grow the virus, which is not easy to do, like I said, and found that the stuff coming out of people's nose after the fact is just dead virus. It doesn't do anything. It's not infectious. The problem is that we don't have easy ways to test other than sending the virus to a special lab to try to grow it. So there are definitely people who had COVID, got better, and then got an illness again, got their nose swabbed, and tested positive again. Now initially, again, those people were accused, or it was said that they had it twice. Now the thought is maybe they just got a regular old virus the second time, and they were one of those people that are just shedding it for a long period of time. So the answer is we don't really know, and we don't have access to the testing that would answer the question. It's certainly not a common thing. It's more of a nuisance than anything, because we would have liked to be able to clear people to go back to work when they stop testing positive from their swabs, and we just can't do that because some people test positive over and over and over again. And now there are people who had COVID this spring and summer who are catching regular colds like people do this time of year. And if they are one of those unlucky ones that keep shedding virus, they're going to test positive. So it doesn't exactly make sense from what we know. I think for me, the most reassuring thing about the vaccine, the Moderna one, was not the 95% of efficacy. It was that 0 people that got the vaccine got anything more than a little bit of a cold. And that tells me it's blocking the subsequent response, that rather than it being an overreaction the second time or with the re-exposure, it modulates, it makes it into not much of an illness. And that's exactly what we had hoped for.
I have one question. I think it says you all have tested about 1,379 people. How many of those would be duplicates?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I would just be making a wild guess. That would be kind of a Lyra type question. But I can tell from when I order COVID tests that it feels to me like maybe 20% of the people I'm ordering them on have a COVID test already in the system. That would be a wild guess on my part, but somewhere between 20% and a third, so maybe a quarter of people.
Right. And then, like you say, like if I go somewhere and I'm gonna have my eye done, I'm gonna have to have a COVID test. So what percentage of the 1,379 you think are people that feel they have, well, I guess it's not many because we've only got 41 cases, so that's the answer. Never mind, I answered my own question. I'm good. Chelsea, any questions? Any more, Michael, from the audience?
No.
I have one more question, and it might be kind of a ridiculous question, but I'm just curious, why has this vaccine been so easy to develop as opposed to other vaccines for other different things that have years and years and years and years and years, and we don't have a vaccine for them? Why is this one so easy to develop? Or the appearance that it's easy to develop?
Yeah, well, certainly faster. And I think part of it was that there was so much funding poured into these companies that they were able to do trials with 30,000 people in a matter of weeks. I mean, we've never seen that before. It takes usually years to enroll that many people, and there isn't that sort of breakneck, let's get everybody enrolled. Now, normally there wouldn't be, you wouldn't be applying for emergency use authorization on a vaccine. That's not something that we, it may have come up with Ebola. I don't know the history long enough, but in general, a vaccine would have been developed, slowly over years, and there would have been some time to wait and see, how long the immunity was going to last if people got it 2 or 3 years later. Most viruses are not ones that would kind of cycle through rapidly every year. And so, if you take something like measles or chicken pox, for example, it's always kind of around. And so when you're testing a kid, you're testing them to see from the point they got their vaccine at age 5, and you're waiting to see, did they get it at age 12? Did they get it at 15? Did they get it at 20? And now we know that the chickenpox vaccine has to be redosed when we're older to prevent shingles. So it's these sort of long studies looking for infection over years to even decades, looking at long-term side effects, but most of those appear fairly early on, and then not having the ability to enroll tens of thousands of patients in a matter of weeks. So, the idea that are we cutting some corners, the two pieces we don't know about, could there be some really long-term effects? The answer is yes, there could be. I don't want to lie and say, oh no, we've waited enough time to know that there's not going to be. Most of the immunologic effects you'd see a little bit early, and so I think we're feeling pretty good that we haven't seen any increase, any change in the signal, but long term for us now means 9 months, and that's not that long. But again, I can tell you, working on this COVID curriculum, the long-term effects from getting COVID are very real, and those are not small. So that's where I would much rather take my chances on the vaccine, which is targeted, than getting COVID, even if I don't die from the disease. Even not being able to taste wine, that would diminish the quality of my life. And if I lost my taste, that would be a huge bummer. So I would take a vaccine just to be able to keep tasting wine for the rest of my life. And that alone would be enough to drive me towards it. But I think the main thing was going to be the breakneck speed that we were able to enroll patients in studies, and they were working around the clock on the vaccines. But you saw England, come up with, and then Germany come up with vaccines in the same time frame. So I think everybody poured everything into this to get it out there, and with patients at breakneck speed, and that's why we're seeing a vaccine a month later.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Dr. Davis, it's always a pleasure to have you. Thank you.